Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. A real privilege to be on the call, and with the help of God, coaches who've logged on will get something from this. Really, what I'm going to talk about tonight is just about, I suppose, my practice and how it's developed over the years and through experience, and maybe a bit of upskill and some useful principles or theories I've come across that I try to apply in my own coaching. And also I've kind of put this together maybe for coaches who are involved in maybe, coaching children, youths and adults, and hopefully there's something in there for everybody. And if you have questions as we go on, I'm happy to take them, and stop me at any point if something doesn't make sense, or you've a question that you'd like to ask. So really what I'm going to cover over the next maybe 30-40 minutes is just consider the things that influence our coaching practice. And I'll talk about my experiences and some of the things and the people that have influenced my coaching over the few years. And maybe as I talk through it, you might be able to reminisce a bit maybe, and identify some of your influences. Look at what does effective coaching look like, or what are the skills needed to be an effective coach? And I would really love to hear your thoughts on that as we go through the presentation. Considerations for an evidence-based approach to coaching. So, over the last number of years, I've got an opportunity to go and do a bit of upskilling, and even the last, I suppose, 12 months, we've had lots of webinars like this, and I've been able to listen to different speakers, different coaches, and I've picked up lots of good stuff from those people and tried to apply it to my own coaching, and I also look at some of the research around coaching, and as I said, how we can apply to our own practice. And then just maybe finish off with some considerations going forward, maybe some takeaways from the presentation, and I'll certainly share some of my takeaways, and I think I've tried to summarize them in about 8 points. So I'm going to very quickly talk about, I suppose, my journey into coaching, and it really all started, as maybe it did for a lot of us in terms of the context of GAA. This is a picture of my primary school back home in East Galway, in Clonfert, and the school was very, very GAA orientated, particularly around hurling and camogie, and the principal there was a big hurling man, and the rule at lunchtime was if you didn't play hurling, you had to do laps of the pitch. So for me, that was okay, but for my brother, who was a big soccer fan, he did a lot of laps of the pitch. But I suppose as part of that experience, during the week, we got a chance to experience a coach who'd come in to us once a week and help us with our hurling and develop our skills. And I remember thinking at a young age, it's not just a great job, it's not just something you'd love to do when you get older. I thought it was the best job in the world. And I suppose it was my first kind of experience of maybe our inclination of getting into coaching. In college, having attended Athlone and being able to have completed a business degree in sports management, I got an opportunity to complete some of my coaching badges, not just in Gaelic games, but also in soccer and other sports. And I really enjoyed, I suppose, those courses and those experiences. And as part of the course, getting the opportunity to go on work experience for the summer and work on various sports camps and various GAA camps, and get an experience about what coaching was all about, and maybe working with children and figuring out, did I enjoy it? Was it for me? And I was certainly for me a positive experience, and kind of led me down that coaching path. Having finished college, going directly to Dublin and getting a job as a games promotion officer with Dublin GAA and Kilmacud Crokes, and again having another wonderful experience, and getting experience in different aspects of coaching, not just coaching children, but also becoming a coach developer, delivering coach education programs, and I suppose having to learn new skills around that, being able to develop relationships with with parents, with teachers, with club administrators. And I suppose for me, being probably pretty introverted, I would say that was definitely a challenge, but also was a real kind of a positive part of my development as a coach. From that, I played 8-9 years with the Dublin Hurlers and retired back in 2016, and suddenly found myself with all this free time. And I suppose it gave me an opportunity to go and do a bit more upskilling. And I spoke to a lady called Caroline Curd at the time, who was involved with Dublin, and got some advice for her around sports psychology. It was something that I'd been really interested in. And you know, sports psychology and coaching, and how does that work together? So from that, completing a master's in sport, exercise, and performance psychology in Jordanstown. And in that year, I learned a huge amount around motivation and how athletes are motivated, and how us as coaches can really, you know, influence that motivation and set up that motivational climate. And it's something I'll speak about through the presentation. And currently, you know, leading on from that, I'm not sure if it's a wise or unwise decision, but I've taken on a doctorate in UCD in elite performance. And I suppose the area I'm interested in is around coach development, how we, as a coach developer, how we better support volunteer coaches in the GAA. And I have a particular interest around the psychological aspect, because I think looking at the player pathway in the GAA, we've lots of stuff around technical, tactical, physical, but I feel we're light on the psychological side. So what I'd like to do is support coaches in terms of how they coach the psychological skills around goal setting, around commitment, around coping under pressure, around realistic performance valuation, how we can turn those skills into coaching skills, just like we do the technical and tactical skills in Gaelic games. I suppose along that journey, I've got an opportunity to work with many different teams, and you know, I've learned, you know, some really valuable lessons from working with those teams, some of which I'll speak about in just a few minutes. And I'm going to talk about coaching at the beginning for me and what it looked like. And really, it was lots of stuff around organization, me being in control, lots of stuff around yelling and telling, and being obsessive around session content. And when I'm reading some of the coaching literature now, kind of it certainly aligns with my early coaching experience, looking at the focus on behavior management as opposed to coaching skills. And looking back on how that was formed and looking at the research, I suppose the attitude towards the coaching role is formed by previous experience in sports as a participant, and the philosophy of the coach. So really, it's about, you know, coaching the way you were coached. And when you think about it, it does make sense. I've had many coaches throughout my career, and you pick up lots of stuff from each of those coaches and their philosophy. But then you have to develop your own style, and you have to kind of develop your own coaching philosophy. But really, in my early days, I really forgot about what we see in a lot of the coaching courses in the GAA, the how to coach skills. I didn't once think about how to build rapport, maybe how to observe or what to observe, and maybe the importance of providing feedback and what that looks like for a child, what that looks like for a youth, and what that looks like for an adult. And really, I think for me, what I've had to work hard on as a coach is those skills. Not really much around the session content or the drills, but more about how to build rapport and how to provide feedback and effective feedback at that. And I suppose I'll tell you a quick story about maybe a lesson I learned on that. And my first adult team I was involved in back in, could have been 2014, 2015, coming to the end of my intercounty playing career, and kind of known that I wanted to go into coaching more. I took on a team, and really, as you see on the screen, obsessed with lots of drills, lots of the content, telling players what to do, and really being detached about what their needs and wants. And at the end of the season, I got a real eye opener around the feedback from the players, around my behavior, the negativity around that, the negativity around the feedback towards the players, and I suppose the lack of variation in the drills. And I suppose for me, I thought I was, taking drills from what I'd seen at the intercounty level and tried to apply them, and thought they're cutting edge stuff. And I completely forgot about the needs and wants of the players, and about who they were and how to connect with them and how to build rapport. So I suppose a great phrase I keep with me now. I think I got it from Lee Moggan, or I might have been Paddy Butler, about building a rapport, about the importance of having to connect before you correct. And I think that's something that now when I get involved with teams, it's the first thing I try and do, is trying to say hello to the player, get to know who they are, what they work at, if they're in college, and build that rapport. And it just a really valuable lesson for me in the early part of my coaching journey. Even though for me, being a full-time coach, having, I suppose that experience really changed my outlook in coaching. And I'm going to talk about some of my other influences, as well as, I suppose, the educational aspect and the experience of and the experiences. What else has influenced my coaching? My playing career, for me, has definitely helped, and it's also at times been a hindrance, but helped in terms of, being able to put myself in the player's shoes, and being able to kind of understand, their experiences before games, especially before big games. Being able to I suppose understand how they're feeling, certainly around pre-season when it's a tough slog, and when players are rushing from jobs or college and trying to be at a certain place at a certain time, and having been in those shoes and walked that path, I think it can certainly, I'm using that experience more now to help players and connect with players. It's also a hindrance in the fact that I was a full back, so my game was around discipline and minding the house. And I suppose for me as a player, I would have been very, very disciplined and very logical. But, as a coach now, coaching 30, 40 players, you have to remember you're dealing with 30 or 40 different personalities. And you've some players like the way I was, and you have some players like who are more creative. And it's about how you connect with those players. I've had lots of coaches throughout my career, and when I take a look back, there's probably 3 who stand out that made a real influence on my playing career. And that was my primary school principal, it was my minor intercounty coach, and it was, I suppose, the man you see on the screen, Anthony Daly, when he took charge of Dublin. And it wasn't because, I suppose, why did they make the impact? It wasn't really because they knew all about how to coach, or they knew all about tactics or the technical aspect. It was really about, I suppose, the way they were able to connect with me when I really take a deep dive into it, and how they spoke to me, and I suppose how I felt that I could really kind of just play the game without being worried what they say or what they do. And I suppose Dale in particular, he could speak many different languages, and what he'd say to me, it was not necessarily what he'd say or how he'd speak to someone like Conal Keeney or Ryan Dwyer, for example. He was able to know how players like to be communicated to. And I remember being on a training camp many years ago, and we took this I think it was called a personality test, an Enneagram test, to find out kind of what personality types we had. So he was able to communicate better to us because he wanted to find out what type of people we were. And in my I suppose in my own coaching, I'm kind of taking those lessons and trying to implement them into how I coach. I suppose the other influences are around maybe, you know, your peers, other coaches, people you work with, having people to bounce things off, I suppose, as coaches, having critical friends. You know, I'm very fortunate to have a couple of critical friends who if I have a problem, I can go ask their opinion. If I've dealt with a situation and I'm unsure of, they're very, very quick to kind of, I suppose, give it to me straight. But also been able to learn from other coaches, and in my coaching career, I've been able to learn from more experienced coaches, attend workshops, you know, pick up the phone, ask of their advice. And I think that's really important as coaches, that we have that support around us, that we can really, you know, feel less isolated, I suppose, and have that experience and have that mentor in your coaching career, that you're able to ask those questions. And the other influence, really, probably obvious, is the players. And I spoke about the early experience around, you know, coaching and maybe what the players taught me then. But, you know, what you have to remember is that they're not just hurlers. They're also people, and they've other responsibilities in their lives. They've other commitments, and as a coach, you have to be able to accommodate that. And, you know, there's a picture of a few of the elite guys I worked with, and they're all top guys, but they also have other responsibilities. And if I as a coach, or if you as a coach want to get the best of your players, you have to be able to accommodate that. It can't be just your way or the highway. And if you do, you'll get loads back from those players, because players are caught in work. Players are rushing from college. Players do have assignments to do, and it's about being able to accept that, to support those players, because you'll get more buy-in from those players in the long run. And this is actually a quote that was sent to me recently from a friend of mine. It's a quote from John Wooden. I'm sure, you know, a lot of coaches, we've all read a lot of John Wooden's work, and I love this quote. A coach is someone who can give correction without resentment. And again, that's a skill, and it brings me back to the earlier point about, you know, the importance of that connection. Connect before you correct, because if you are constantly correcting a player and you haven't made the effort to get to know them, to talk with them, and them to realize that you have their best interests at heart, it doesn't really matter how much tactics, you know, how much knowledge you have on the technical aspect. It's just not going to stick with those players. So look, a question I'd like to pose to the group, and I'd, you know, maybe Quiva, if you're there, you can maybe take some feedback in the chat box. But put the question out there for you as coaches. What does effective coaching look like for you? What have you seen that you think is effective, or maybe what do you think are the skills needed to be an effective coach? And again, I have some ideas around that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. So yeah, I might give it a minute.
See what comes in through the chat box. But even for myself, I definitely relate to a lot of what you're saying. You know, you have to have that rapport, and people have to, I guess, enjoy being around you first and foremost. They have to trust you before they listen to you. Really, isn't that the main part?
Absolutely.
So lads, if anyone has any ideas there, so someone put in that it's enjoyable. Effective coaching is enjoyable. That you're using the right language with the players.
Yep.
Very important, yeah.
Absolutely. And look, all really valid points, and I think all really useful tools that a coach needs in order to be effective. Apologies if you've seen this already, but again, reading around some of the literature around coaching and taking the quote from Coate and Gilbert around effective coaching and what is it? It's the consistent application of, you know, professional knowledge, interpersonal skills, and intrapersonal knowledge to improve athletes' competence, confidence, connection, and character in specific coaching contexts. And taking a deeper dive into that, and it's some of the stuff that the coaches have just mentioned there. What are professional skills? Really, they're around, you know, knowing the technical skills, knowing how to develop players tactically, physically, psychologically, and knowing, and I suppose that's why we have our coach education program, because we get those skills by going on those formal coach education courses, by going on maybe on those informal workshops, by talking to more experienced coaches. Because if what I'm learning is that if I want to my players to improve, well, then I need to improve as a coach, and that's where that improvement has to come. We as coaches have to constantly evolve, have to constantly improve to gather that professional knowledge. It's also about our interpersonal skills. Particularly if you're coaching young players, you have to be able to communicate effectively and interact with their parents, with officials, referees, with maybe the administrators in the club or in the county, and be able to build those relationships, because that's part of coaching. And having the interpersonal skills to be able to review, revisit and reflect on your coaching practice. And I'll talk a bit about reflection, because for me it's changed over the years, and I'll discuss that in a second. But your interpersonal skills, being able to control your emotions, and I suppose I learned a great deal from that, even in my experience with Leash and observing the likes of Eddie Brennan, for example. Having been able to say the right things at the right time, maybe having taken a couple of bad defeats, which we did, and not losing his temper, and being able to communicate effectively in terms of what happened and where we need to go. And I think being able to control your emotions is a really important part of being an effective coach. And part of that, I suppose, interpersonal knowledge is being able to review. And a lot of my reviewing now takes place, I suppose, on the drive home in the car, as I suppose it might be similar for some other coaches, about how the session went. And in the past, the review would have been all about the session plan, all about look at what worked well, in the next time, where do we need to work on, and less about the personal correction. Now I've definitely moved towards the personal bit, where I'm looking at, how well did I communicate that aspect of coaching to players. If we're working on a certain aspect of play, how well did I articulate that? Did I ask the right questions? If a situation cropped up in the session, how did I handle that? Could I have handled that better? And also, if a player asked me a question, did I answer that in the right way, or did I just bluff it? And the one thing I'll say to coaches is, whatever you do, don't bluff. If you don't know, you say you don't know, and say we'll go and we'll figure it out together, or you'll go and find out. Because the one thing that players will definitely figure out very quickly is if you're a bluffer. And you're better off being honest and being authentic if you don't know the answer. So for me, it's about coming back from a session, and if I didn't know how to handle a situation, where do I find the answers? Who do I talk to? So I can have that answer when I come back, or I can at least have that discussion with the player and help them improve. And I think, just for me, as I was putting this presentation together, and I think there's a big bit around, I suppose, the things that I'm studying now are around reflective practice, and it's definitely drawn me towards the personal reflection bit in terms of how I interact with the players as opposed to the session plan. Because I keep making the point, if we can allow the players to trust us, and they can trust you, well, then I think they'll buy into the rest of it.
Perfect.
So don't worry about all this. This is just a follow-on in terms of effective coaching, and it's really looks at what else the coaches need to know. And I've just taken some of this from the coaching literature, and look. I've looked at a couple of the coaching models. We've talked about Colton Gilbert's one, and maybe I'm going to talk about Andy Abraham's one, and maybe how I apply it in different contexts. But for anybody who's coaching youths or children, there's some really good stuff I've come across in this. And I suppose UK Sport Coach Development and the English Institute of Sport Performance have to come together and try to look at how they align their coaching and how they really support coaches who are working with players on the developmental pathway. And I suppose on that coaching position statement, one of the things that they've highlighted is that when you're coaching young players, it cannot be a copy and paste job. So it cannot be a situation where, we're taking stuff from the elite athletes. In this case, it might be your senior club team, it might be your inter-county team, and then apply it to youth players, because it's an entirely different context. It also, some research looks around, a coach who's able to understand, developmental principles around the relative age effect. A coach who knows how to influence an athlete's motivation, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, along with having kind of the coaching knowledge and being able to understand how these factors interact and, form training sessions to meet the demands of the athlete. So really, what the literature is saying is actually that while the senior coach is important, the most important people are the coaches who work with children and youths, because those are the coaches who have the biggest impact on their development. While the senior coach who gets players at the adult level, in a way they're formed, and while we can still develop them, the most important aspects of development take part along that development pathway. And I'm going to show you a quote from Stephen Gerrard, and I'm just going to let you read it for a second, and then look, I'll give you my take on it. And this is him before he went on to take the job maybe at Rangers. So I suppose for me, that's a very interesting comment, because you're looking at a coach maybe who's involved in professional football and who wants to get to the top. And I suppose that's where all the money is going into. But if we're looking at that from even a GA context, and looking at maybe some of the comments there around, I know I can work with the 18s because it allows me to make lots of mistakes. And really, that's interesting, because if we as coaches are making lots of mistakes during key developmental, I suppose, windows with our players, well, then there's a real issue there around how we develop them. And I suppose when we look at maybe the GA, are we better off putting our resources? Because I'm looking at maybe my own club here, and I suppose all the resources, we talk about the best facilities, and maybe the financial backing goes into the senior players and the senior coach, and whereas if we know our coaches on the youth pathway and on the child pathway are the most important, we need to be putting the resources into those coaches to support them, to upskill them, because we know if we can make our coaching better at those aspects or at those areas, well, then we're going to get a better player when they get to senior. And I just thought it was a very interesting kind of comment from Stephen Gerrard. I'm just going to take that off the screen. I'm going to very quickly talk about, I suppose, a coaching theory around Andy Abrahams, and it just looks at, I suppose, the context of, if you're taking a team, if you're a coach who's going to a new club, if you've coached at the under 18 level, now you're going to coach maybe an under 10 team, looking at who are you coaching, what are their wants and needs, what are you coaching, and how are you going to do it? So for me, even moving from Laois to Wexford, I kind of looked at this and say, well, where are these players at now? Who are these guys? Where are they? What are their needs and wants? How can I help? What can I apply around the technical, tactical stuff? And how am I going to do it? And I think that's really an effective a model to use if you're going to go into a different coaching context or work with a different team. And I'm going to talk a bit about maybe the how, the what, sorry, the who, the what, and the how, looking at Andy Abraham's coaching model. And something around, I suppose, the who bit. I love this from the LGFA and looking at their player pathway and looking at the coaching style required, looking at who you're coaching and the style required, and looking at the nursery, for example, and knowing that it might be a direct style of coaching. Why? Because you're looking at really novice players, beginners players. They need lots of instruction. They need to be allowed to make mistakes, but they need lots of help from the coach in order to improve. So they need lots of instruction. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, looking at the adult level, and the coaching style is different. It might be about involving the players, getting them to self-evaluate, asking lots of questions, ensuring that their involvement of lots of players in decision making, involving them in how we play, asking them questions, and making those sessions challenging. And sometimes what I'm realizing, you might use lots of styles in the one session. So I'll give you an example. Last night with the Wexford lads, I was both directive and I had to involve them in certain aspects. So we tried a new game, for example. It was a new aspect of play we're trying to develop. So at the beginning, I was very, very directive in terms of giving clear instruction, what the purpose was. But as they tried the game or as they developed that aspect, well, then it was about more involving them and how the game went, asking them questions, checking for understanding, getting their interpretation. And I'm sure that that's the same for you guys, that you'll use many different coaching styles. But if you're not sure in terms of what style might be to what particular age group, I think that's a nice little framework to work off. In terms of what the coach, I think, I've just showed that the player pathway we work off here in Crokes, and I think under that pathway, under different stages, we have the technical, tactical, physical, psychological, and it's about, well, what technical aspects are important for an under 10, and then what are the technical aspects or tactical aspects important for maybe an under 16 player, and the player pathway can be a really nice guide for coaches to, well, look at what should I be doing as a coach. If it's under 16, well, maybe you're looking about principles of play, learning how to defend, learning how to attack. If you're an under 12, it might be about learning how to play different positions. If you're an under 10, it might be all about the skills, learning to strike of both sides, kick of both feet, and maybe using the activities in games to develop those skills. It might be, again, using at the young ages the fundamental movement skills. At the older ages, looking at athletic development, looking at functional competence, looking at resources around the GEA 15, for example, and how we can develop that. And then the how bit is about the knowledge. Knowing the who and the what. How am I going to apply this? What activities, what drills, what games do I need to know and do I need to understand and do I need to apply in order to develop these players? And I suppose when one of the questions, and I went to a friend of mine called Ed Corcoran, who's a skill acquisition expert, and when I went to Laois, one of the things I wanted to kind of really be sure upon was whatever we did in the pitch, it was going to transfer onto match day. And I suppose it was around the how, and he gave me this really kind of really good theory that I still use when I'm looking to plan sessions. And now I haven't seen it in any of the research papers, but look, for me, it's a nice guiding principle in terms of planning my sessions. And he just said, look, make sure your session is relevant, that it's relevant to the game you're playing, it's relevant movements, there's lots of decisions, and that players aren't doing things that are completely unrelated to what they'll have to face in a match. That there's context to it. So are you putting players in situations they're going to face in the game? So an example might be that if you're playing against a sweeper, how are you going to deal with that? If you get a player sent off after 45 minutes, how are we going to cope with that? If you are 3 points up with 5 minutes to go, how are we going to stay out the game? How are we going to deal with that? So lots of the coaching would have been around putting those players in those situations and running the game and asking lots of questions and basically trying to problem solve that. What will we do if this happens? How are we going to do it? And getting the players input in that. Now, the context, say, at an underage level might be around, look, are you giving a chance to players to play different positions? In full back, then up to full forward, the corner back to wing forward. So you're giving that player a chance to play in different positions, learn different skills, and get kind of an awareness and gain knowledge around what those different positions require. And the last bit was around consequence. And I'd be very, very careful to use consequence with young players. But I think I suppose the background of this is that we're trying to, in games, there's consequences, and we're trying to create that environment where in training sessions for every action there might be a consequence. And how did we create that? It was around maybe, I remember one player who was consistently taking shots from the sideline about 50 yards out, and the ball either went wide or kept dropping short. So the consequence of that was, what I would put in would be, look, if that happens, well then in a game the opposition get back the ball, but in training, if he does that, well then the consequence of that is he is going to as well as giving the opposition back the ball, it's going to be also worth 2 points to the opposition. So there's a big consequence there. And so it was used as kind of a coaching tool, but it was also used as kind of a fun element. So we'd have played kind of some short internal games, or we'd have put them in the context, look, you're a man up with 5 minutes left, you're 3 points up, let's see out the game. And if they didn't see out the game, the consequence was that the losing team had to carry the winning team off the pitch. And it was a bit of a fun element, or they had to sing a song at the end of the session. But you're trying to build up that kind of that environment where there's a bit of pressure, and how do players cope with that pressure. For young players, be very, very careful. It's about, because you really want players at a young age at all ages really, but especially at a young age, to make lots of mistakes, try things. You don't want to be putting consequences on every mistake they make. So I think, but for maybe even the youth or adult level, for me, it's a very, very kind of useful theory that I use when I'm planning sessions. I'm going to speak a bit about motivation and about maybe what I picked up from maybe my time in Jordanstown and athlete motivation, and how I've tried to apply to my coaching. And there was a theory which I'm sure you've come across before, called the self-determination theory by DC and Ryan, and it states that humans have 3 psychological needs: that the need to feel competence, the need to feel a connection or relatedness, and the need for autonomy, or to feel that they're in control. And in a sporting context, the more as coaches that we can meet those needs, the more intrinsically motivated our athletes become. So you can see on the top right that we have the self-determination continuum. And really what we want to do is we want players involved in our sport because they have an interest, because they enjoy it, because they get huge satisfaction, as opposed to doing it because, look, there's an ego there, or they're doing it for maybe fear of punishment or for an external reward. And as coaches, how do we create that motivational climate where players are on the intrinsic side of the continuum as opposed to maybe the extrinsic? And a nice little activity that our 2011 coaches did with their boys maybe 18 months ago was to kind of understand the motivation for their players attending their sessions. So they put together a little Google Doc form, and they asked questions, and they got the parents to help the boys fill out the questionnaire about, why does your son play GAA? What does he like about the Go games? What does he not like? What does he like about training? What does he not like about training? What is fun for your son? Name one thing that your son would like the coaches to do more of. Name one thing that your son would like the coaches to do less of. And I suppose you can imagine some of the feedback the coaches got. But it was really, really good. It was really kind of interesting in terms of some of the feedback that came back around what players enjoyed, what they wanted more of. And for some coaches, it was a real eye-opener in terms of, God, things around. I didn't realize that I shouted so much, or I didn't realize the players perceived me as a shouter, and that was really kind of interesting from the coach's perspective. So really, in terms of going back to the self-determination theory, the question is, how can we apply this to our coaching? So I'm going to give you some of my experiences in terms of how I've tried to apply this in terms of developing competence, connection, and autonomy, and how we can create that environment. But also, I'm going to show you a quick case study I came across, looking at kind of I suppose Olympic athletes and how the coach applied the self-determination theory to basically improve performance. And he worked with the Australian senior relay team, and they were preparing for the Olympics in Athens in 2004. And so, how did he apply this theory? What did he do? He looked at, in terms of providing autonomy or providing choice, he allowed input from the athletes around training content, around times they were training, the venues they trained on, and the uniforms they wore. Some of them, obviously, they were preparing for the Olympics. They had sports psychologists, they had nutritionists, and they also brought those people in as part of that process. As part of in the semi-final, there was one athlete who didn't perform well, so there was decisions given back to the team around maybe the makeup of the team and how the composition of the team, and that was around the autonomy bit. There was also stuff around, I suppose, that connection, and I think, how do we make players feel valued in the setup? Very simply, actively seeking their opinions, their suggestions, taking their feedback, giving them an input in terms of the tactics. I think, and you can apply that to any context. If you're with an adult team, I think the first things I do is, maybe while I might have my ideas, the first thing I do, I bring it to the players and get some suggestions and feedback off them. And I suppose around the competence bit, and this was really interesting, and the competence bit was around the baton change. And so in terms of the feedback, it was the athlete, the feedback would come from the athletes themselves first, what worked, what didn't work. The second bit of feedback would come from their teammates, and then if the coach had to step in, the third bit of feedback would come from the coach. So from that, and looking at that approach, I suppose what happened in terms of performance, they produced their season's best at Athens. They were ranked 14 going into it, and they finished in 6th position. So while what does it show? And there's other examples maybe that I can share afterwards. For bringing this back to my own experience as a coach and applying this theory, especially around the connection bit. And if you're in a group of 30, certainly at any group, but if you can only pick 26 players or 30 players in the squad, for example, and maybe only 15 of those can play, I suppose out of competence, out of autonomy, and out of connection, the most important bit is connection, because the guys who aren't playing, or the girls who aren't playing, have to feel valued. So what can you do, and what did we do? There was stuff around the games and giving feedback and video analysis sessions. So for example, after games, it was the players who weren't playing, their advice, their suggestions, their feedback from the game sought, and they had to feed back to the players who had played in terms of what they saw, what worked, what didn't work. They were given important roles around standards, around the leadership group, and they were given input in terms of the tactical development. And I think that was really important because, look, while they weren't playing, sometimes they also had a part to play. And I think that's just an example. The confidence bit for us would have been, if you're working trying to develop confidence in games, even when in league games or champion games when it didn't go well, showing bits of when it worked. So in relation to our game plan, having clips of when we were competent, when we executed really well, what that looked like, how well players were able to do it, and kind of having that positive slant on it. And remember, it brings back to kind of when Liam Sheedy took over Tipperary back in 2009. I think he spent the first year just showing the players everything that worked, all the positive clips, how great they were, and also building that confidence around the choices. So giving players the opportunity to, if there was a problem in the backs or a problem in the forwards, that giving the backs an opportunity in the next session to problem solve and come up with an activity or a game that might help solving that problem. And there was some great stuff that the players came back with, and even in my own coaching in schools, for example, giving young players a choice of what games they want to play, or look at, we're going to work on catching, what game might work for catching, or what's your favorite game, or how can we improve that? And it's amazing the feedback you'll get from players. So I suppose the question I'm going to pose to coaches tonight is, what steps can you take to facilitate intrinsic motivation in your players? How can you increase, autonomy? How can you increase the connection? And how can you increase the competence of your players? And it might be just something that you might reflect upon at the end of the session. I suppose my take-home points, and what I'm kind of, to put it into 8 points, and some of the stuff I took from, I think I listened to Stuart Lancaster, it might have been last year, the year before, in terms of, if you have limited time with your players, how can you make the biggest impact? And as coaches, we might get our players for once or twice a week, and how can we make the biggest impact? How can we ensure that when we've ran that session, that they've learned something, they've enjoyed it, they've developed, they've gotten better? And so there's a number of questions that I suppose I've just posed here, and one of them is to consider: are you coaching or are you organizing? And to make sure you've spent time creating and planning your session that caters for all the players. And that can take time, because you might be in a group and there's lots of differentiation, and how do you accommodate for all the players? But also, for me as a novice coach, being obsessed with the session content and forgetting to coach, and having a balance. And what I've also learned that if you are the coach with 30 players, you can't do it yourself. You have to have people around you that help with the organizing, that help with aspects of coaching. So if you're a parent coach and you're expected to coach by yourself, and you have 20 or 30 players with you, you need a parent team with you to even organize the drills or organize the games, so you can actually help with the coaching. Is it fun, enjoyable, and competitive? And we're all competitive, and there's stuff around. I'd always include, if I'm coaching at the nursery level or I'm coaching at the senior and intercounty level, I'd always have times and targets, because all players love times and targets and beating their score and competing against themselves. They also love variation. So if you're planning for fun, are you using the same games over and over again? Or how many ways can you coach the same skill? There's lots of variations. There's lots of resources out there around games that we can use to coach the same skill. Again, we've talked about, does your training replicate situations that occur in the game? We've talked lots around that. Is your session creating behavioral change, so it becomes hardwired into players? And there's two aspects of that for me. And it might be around standards. So you might be developing commitment in your players. So are you developing behaviors that players are turning up early for training? And how do you set that up? So your coach system might be that you might be, as a coach, arriving early to train. You might have the balls the session laid out. So when players come early, that they can work on their skills, or you use a coach or helping them work on their skills, and that you're also as a coach behavior, that you're promoting the behaviors of the players who turn up early. And I think that you're encouraging the players to kind of develop the players who need that bit of encouragement to develop those players. The other aspect around behavioral change might be around your coaching. So if you're working on an aspect of defending or forward play, and the players are still making the same mistakes, 6 weeks down the line or 8 weeks down the line, what's happening? Is it your coaching? Is there a misunderstanding? Do you need to kind of take a step back and look at why we're still making those same mistakes? The bit around getting point 5, get the balance right between structured and unstructured, drills versus games. I know there's a big debate out there around drills versus games, and look, I'd use both, because for me sometimes drills, while maybe the sports science out there says that maybe they don't develop skill, but what they do develop in the player is confidence. And I've spoken to lots of players. I was a player myself, going to the hurling wall, pucking balls off the wall, developing that confidence, going away from that hurling wall, developing confidence and bringing that to the pitch. So don't forget that. But also our games is about unpredictability, so it has to be unstructured. Lots of decisions, lots of different movements, and we have to get the balance right on that. And it might be you might spend an aspect of your session on puck out strategies, but you might spend another aspect around decision making. Again, can we help our players learn through learn to review training and games? And that's really important for young players, because there's another motivational theory out there called achievement goal theory, and it looks at a person's disposition. They're either ego orientated or task orientated, and children at a very young age are all ego orientated. So they equate success, they associate success with winning or losing. And as coaches, for them, if they lose, well, that's a personal failure, and suddenly they're afraid to try. And if they win, well, then they only associate winning with being a success. So as coaches, we have to help them understand that failing is part of learning. It's okay to fail, and with practice and with learning, we can improve. And that's really important for coaches working with young players, that we have these conversations, that we help them to review their training and games, so they know that, look, at part of the process is about making mistakes. It's about losing, and it's about learning, and it's okay to lose, and it's okay to fail. But if we can understand that the more we practice, the more we learn, the more we can improve. And again, really, I'll use Martin Fogarty's Magnificent Seven. If you've been on his webinars, coach the core skills repeatedly. And in hurling, he has the Magnificent Seven around first touch, striking, catching, rising, blocking, hand passing, and hooking. And can we do those in match-like situations? I guess, can players execute those skills in the game and execute them expertly well? And really, then the last point is around create as many decisions in the sessions, so you can review the quality of the decision making. And for me, that's about really having conversations with players around decisions they made and why they make them. And if it's aspects of forward play, why did you make that pass? What did you see? Were there other options? And having those conversations. And even at the young ages, at the under 8s and 10s, if it's hurling, you might put away the hurling, you might just use the ball and work on throwing and catching, but the aspect might be decision making. It might be, why did you pass there? Where were the other options? What could your teammates do to help you make a better decision? And you could bring in stuff around movement. And I think for me, they're kind of the 7 or 8 points that I always look at when I'm planning sessions, or I'm working with teams or working with players, in terms of how I can make an impact. Look, that's it from me, folks. I've gone on long enough. I hope you've taken something from it, and I'm happy to take questions if people have them.
Thanks so much for that, Niall. That was excellent. I think yeah, we've time for one or two questions anyway, guys. There is one in the chat box that I'll throw to you. And if anyone else has a question, please throw it in. But just around the connect before correction thing, Brian is just saying that he totally believes in it. But he's wondering, why do you think that this has changed from the time that himself 20 years ago or so was coached? So he thinks that at the moment older coaches or older folk find it hard to understand this new method, and I think around that a whole thing of players getting participation medals, and they find that quite difficult to understand. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I suppose, look, when I was growing up, I was just you did as you were told, and the coach was the boss, and you never questioned or anything. But now I think what's happening is, look, society has changed. People are more informed. I think players are more informed now. Players now are going to college. They're educated. They're in jobs. Like they know, and they go away and they research, what good coaching practice is, and they also kind of have a better value of themselves, and they're more inquisitive because of, I suppose, that education. So I I think if you're going to, as a coach, if you're going to come with something now, you have to have a rationale for it, and you have to be able to explain that to the players, because they're going to ask questions around that. And because of their, I suppose, because of their education, I think education is the word. I think that they are more informed, and I think that's a result of maybe of how society has changed. So I suppose that's the short answer. Is all I can say.
Brilliant, brilliant. One question in then as well. Might be an insider question now. Who drives the standards at training in Wexford?
Well, I've only been there one session, so I think I can't really answer that. Well, I can, but look, the players really have do that, and they've done it in a brilliant way. Like they've come up with a bit of a roster around maybe what's acceptable and what's not acceptable around accountability, but there's a fun element to it. And even last night there was, a training. There was a bit of crack on that. So, and even looking back on my Laois experience, like the players really drove that. And I think one aspect that was really important for us as coaches with the Laois thing was about, we had a couple of sessions around identity, and we kind of posed the questions to the players around, look, forget the medals, forget the cups. At the end of the season, how would you like to be described as a group of people? And I think that was really powerful, because I think, described by your own people, by your peers, by people outside your county, what would they say about you? And I think the players came up with some really good stuff. There was really, some really difficult conversations around maybe what had happened in the past, and maybe how they could get over that. But they come up with their values from that conversation, and they come up with behaviors that honor those values. So, for example, one of them was around honesty. How do we know that we're being honest? What does that look like? If the man walked in from the street, how do we know that this is not an honest group of players? And I think once they set that, I think they started driving that through the standards and what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. And I suppose for us as coaches, then it allowed us to kind of at times pull them up on that. But if I'd come in, or Eddie or Tommy had come in and said, look, this is what it is, they were our words, it wasn't theirs. I think the standards bit, that's where it comes from. That's where it comes from, I think.
Yeah, I think it's always very important that players at least drive some of the standard anyway. Okay, the last question we'll take then is just from Ross Corbett. So, when creating context in your sessions, does this tend to be informed by analysis of your previous games?
Yeah, certainly. So it's interesting. The preseason stuff would be around kind of skill acquisition and decision making, and then once the game starts, there certainly would be maybe a portion of the session that would focus on what happened the last game. What do we learn? So look, for example, last year. I remember playing Wexford, and we took stuff from what they did in their pokeouts, and we spent, 20 minutes in our sessions working on that and what that looked like for us. So I think the context from previous games is really important, because there has to be learnings from every game. And then you have to, for me anyway, as a coach, I'd always put, 15, 20 minutes aside in that session to work on what happened the last game, what in terms of the improvements. So absolutely.
Cool. All right, we have one last question from Paula. In relation to warm-up drills and so on, is it a good idea to have maybe 4 or 5 different training warm-up variations, or is familiarity better?
I suppose from you could have, look, you could have 4 or 5 different aspects in the warm-up. I suppose you could have that variation, but for players, the feedback for me as a player, but also from working with other players, is that they like that consistency. They like that familiarity, so it's part of the routine, particularly towards big games. So they know the warm-up, they know what happens, and it's kind of part of what they do. But I'd have many variations within that warm-up stuff around, look, I suppose ball contacts, because not so much of the skill act stuff, more around the confidence that the players have felt, geez, I'm after striking 50 balls here before the game, my touch is good, and they're bringing that onto the pitch. I'd have lots of stuff around decision making, and then maybe you might have stuff around, maybe if there's certain set plays that you want to execute in the game, maybe just kind of reaffirming them. So that might be the aspects I'd work on within the session. But it will be consistent, I suppose, for every game.
Brilliant. Look, lads, I think we'll wrap it there. That was really, really interesting, Niall. So thank you so much for sharing your experience there. I have a page full of notes here as well. I'm sure everyone else is the same. But yeah, thank you so much for that, and thanks to everyone who logged in. So that was the last of our spring webinars for the moment. This will be available on the website before the end of the week, and we should be announcing a new round of webinars soon enough as well. So just keep an eye out for that. But from us at DSS, Niall, thank you very much for coming on, and the best of luck with the season. Hopefully we get out soon enough.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, cheers, guys. Chat to you later.